Recording now. Okay, that way we know we're being recorded. My name is Robin Young, Mrs. Young, and I'm the school librarian at Avon High School. I want to welcome everyone, and our Avon High School students and staff would like to welcome author Jay Coles for our visit today. Jay is an Indiana author of 2 novels. Tyler Johnson was here in Things We Couldn't Say, which, just so you know, we've been giving these away for about the past 2 months to many of our students so that they could read them and participate in our event. You also have chapters published in Black Enough and Hungry Hearts, and so those are available as well here in our high school library. Mr. Coles is a graduate of Vincennes University and Ball State University, and he currently lives in Muncie. Although, are you staying in Muncie?
Yeah, I will be staying around Muncie for a little bit longer.
Okay, all right. And then in addition to writing, he's a composer and a professional musician. So welcome, Jay Coles.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here today. That is a wonderful explanation of who I am and what I do and what I'm about. So, thanks for having me.
We're very excited to have you. Very, very excited. Are you going to be presenting information, talking about kind of if you want to tell us a little bit about your background and life growing up? I know us being on the west side of Indianapolis, you grew up very close to us. So if you want to give us a little information about your background in life, that would be awesome.
Yeah, of course. I've always lived in Indiana. I grew up in Indianapolis before going to college and ending up in Muncie. But I went to Ben Davis High School, which I really, really love. And if you've read Things We Couldn't Say, it takes place in Indianapolis, and the main characters go to Ben Davis High School. So it was really fun to kind of revisit that world a little bit in writing that book. But yeah, so my kind of upbringing, I always found myself like as a lover of stories, as a lover of words. And so I would find myself often like in our library and just checking out tons of books. So I would go to our school library, but also like to the public library, just because I was like, I need more books. And I was just really fascinated by the power of story, the power that stories, in particular, like young adult novels, really hold. But I just found myself very, like, I was longing for more. I was longing for stories that really represented like the community that I lived in on the west side of Indianapolis, where there were predominantly Black and brown people. And didn't really get to find stories that really talked about the issues that we faced in those communities and in those neighborhoods, and just in Indianapolis in general. It's a very, I think, underrepresented place in YA literature. But shout out to John Green for writing The Fault in Our Stars there. And I felt like I wanted to take a stab at like talking about issues that were prevalent in the community that I grew up in. And for my debut novel, Tyler Johnson Was Here, which is a book that is about or inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement, talks about like police brutality and race and racism, obviously issues that affect the entire country, but felt like those were issues that also plagued like the community that I lived in. And it's actually based on events that I witnessed and that were part of my life story. And so I decided, as a way to kind of like speak up and to like fight for my voice, I was going to like write a book. And when I remember telling my mom that I was going to write a book, and she was just kind of like, oh, interesting. Like she was kind of like half believing in me, but half being like, that's such a weird thing to say, like not many people are doing that, and I remember doing it and showing like an initial draft to like friends and family, and just felt so encouraged that like I had something there. And after I graduated high school, between like graduating high school and being a freshman in college at Ball State University, I decided to like send it out into the world and send it out to um, literary agents who would then send it to like um, publishing companies. And within like a matter of like months, weeks to months, I got my very first book deal. And that really has launched a really amazing and fruitful experience of getting to share these stories with people and getting to talk to people who might not be part of those communities, right? Or have experience understanding or being involved in some of the issues that I talk about in my books. But for me, it was a lot of like, that was my resistance. That was my activism, was getting to go on tour and talk about these issues with people all across the country. I've been in, high schools in Texas where they're kind of like on one side of the spectrum of like, oh, wanting to be educated because they're just so, that's not a part of their day to day. But then also going back to like Ben Davis and talking to students there and being like, okay, they see themselves represented, and I just feel like a lot of power in that. So yeah, I mean, that's been what I've been doing, and currently I'm working as a full-time writer, which I recently have gotten to start doing, which is very, very fun and exciting. And I'm working on my third young adult novel right now. My editor, David Levithan, has been trying to get me to get that in for months now, and I'm really behind. So thanks for giving me an excuse to, put it off even more.
Oh, there we go. There we go. Well, how old were you when you published your first book then?
Gosh. So I was freshman in college. I would have been 20.
So that's amazing.
Something like that. Something like that, yeah.
That's really amazing. Wow. What was your writing process? Like what's the process that you go through when you write?
I feel like I'm one of those like non-traditional authors who, I say I don't really have like a set process, because everything that I write is had a different kind of experience or a different process. But I can talk about the different processes between my two books. So for Tyler Johnson Was Here, I felt like that was kind of like I didn't have any deadlines, right? So I didn't have, I wasn't writing for a deadline or like a contract or anything like that. I was just writing just to see if I can do it. I almost like to prove a point to myself and to other people. And because again, like I didn't see myself represented in books often that weren't about like slavery or civil rights, which those books are great, but I don't want to read about that all the time. And so I remember sitting down, and the original draft was just a short story of all the events that happened in Tyler Johnson Was Here. It was a short story. And from there, I was like, okay, how can I make this a longer piece of, literature? And so I remember doing like character interviews. So I remember sitting down and was kind of like, okay, I want to know these characters deeper than than you can in like a short story. And so I just remember doing like, it was kind of like me interviewing myself, but like pretending that I was these characters, as a way of getting in their heads to know like what they're about, like who they are, what is driving them, what is their relationship like with this other character, what history do they have, just to kind of have a greater sense of understanding of who these characters were, and from there allowing them to lead me on this journey of like unfolding all the events that happened in that book. And so for that book, I was very detail oriented, and I sat down and actually plotted things. And I had like, I remember on my wall, I put post-it notes in, a bunch of different, places, and I was drawing arrows of like, this is what happened, and I was very just kind of meticulous about it. And I'm not normally someone who plots, or like, I find myself to be more of a pantser than a plotter. Like I find myself just really enjoying sitting down and just kind of letting the words flow, getting to a headspace where I'm just kind of like, I'm feeling you know, what I'm writing, as opposed to like, let me sit down and do like a bubble chart. Because I remember doing that in like middle school, high school English, and I was like, this is the worst. um, but so for my follow-up novel, For Things We Couldn't Say, it was very much like, and I was writing it in the midst of the pandemic, so I just had so much to talk about. And obviously this is a book that is about like lots of grief, and lots of loss, but also like trying to find who you are and what is love. And I was like, okay, I'm not going to plot anything. I'm just going to like sit down and let these characters take me on this journey. I still did like a character interview with some of the characters just to kind of get a greater sense of like who they were, so that I could feel comfortable enough letting them take me on this journey. But they did, and I don't regret doing that, because I feel like, in my opinion, I feel like it worked for the story. So
Yeah. All right. Yeah, obviously it definitely worked for the story. So in Tyler Johnson Was Here, there's obviously you talked about the Black Lives Matter movement and the police action shooting that occurs. You alluded that those were maybe real life events. How did those real life events like mold you into the author that you've become?
mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I feel like when I was sitting down to write Tyler Johnson Was Here, and I was thinking about um, telling those very raw stories, and how I had lost my cousin to police violence, in the neighborhood that I grew up in on the west side of Indianapolis. And um, I felt like revisiting that was like hard. Like, it's like it almost kind of like traumatic to revisit those places for the purpose of writing the book. But I also realized, like, at the end of writing that book, and even going into writing Things We Couldn't Say and beyond, how healing of an experience writing can be, and how it really does kind of mend your heart and piece you back together when you are processing those things on the page, instead of like kind of burying it inside, which is what I'm used to doing. I don't know if anyone here is a fan of the Enneagram, but I'm an Enneagram 9, which just means that like I'm really good at kind of like numbing myself and making myself not feel things. And so I was really having to revisit really, really deep emotions that I had buried. And I feel like that it's made me a more emotionally healthy person and writer. Being able to like talk about those events that feel very raw and real, but also like somewhat controversial in our world, right? Where when that book came out, I received a lot of mixed reviews and a lot of people sending hate mail to my house, and to my email about my book, and people calling me racist because I wrote it and things like that, and was really hard. But I think it's also strengthened me in a lot of ways.
Right. I want to talk about Things We Couldn't Say for just a minute then too. Things We Couldn't Say, I had both of my daughters attended Ben Davis High School. So
Oh,
as
wow.
you were writing, specifically the scene with the giant cafe,
Oh,
and
yeah.
it just kind of brought me back. I'd spent a lot of time in that cafe. So it was very interesting to read that. I also lived on the west side of Indianapolis. So it was all just, places that I knew, or things, called them different things, but I was like, oh, I think that's where that is. And so I love that aspect of being in the Indianapolis area, and that just really making that connection with the book, because I knew the places that it occurred. So that was a really, really cool thing. Geo in this goes through some conflict with his mother, and some problems that he has in knowing who he is and what he's becoming, and based upon his mother's abandonment. Where did you get the ideas for that concept?
Yeah. So again, like when I was writing Things We Couldn't Say, it was the very beginning of the pandemic. And for a lot of us, like, the pandemic kept us in the house, kept us, confined to our little spaces, right? And for me, I just spent an abundance of time like in my like office space where I like write, and I just was so discouraged. I was so discouraged following the reviews that I got of Tyler Johnson Was Here, that I was like, I don't know if I have it in me to write again, to like put out a story where strangers are going to read and have access to sending me negative reviews to my social media, to my email, to my house. I don't know if I can experience that again, or like allow myself to be vulnerable enough to share something intimate about like my life, my world, my community, and feel like it's going to be used against me in some way. And so I gave up writing for a long time. So that there, a few years between when Tyler Johnson came out and when Things We Couldn't Say came out, because I just was like, I've lost all interest in writing, for that reason alone, of like just the fear that I felt. But I was still under contract. I was still under contract to write something else. And so my publisher was kind of like, hey. And my agent was also like, hey, we need some, we get you're sad and everything, but, you know, people want more from you. And I was like, okay. And I just remember taking a week just to like be still and sit with my thoughts and to sit with my heart. And I think what I felt the most, and I think this is something that we felt all collectively during the start of the pandemic, is just like a collective grief of, we're experiencing loss. We're seeing loss daily, in the news and in the media because of, COVID, the COVID death, totals going up every day. And, in some way or another, like our families were all affected. And I just really started resonating with that like deep sense of like grief. And the more that I sat with that, the more things kind of like came up in my life of like things that I've been grieving and I haven't even like been super aware of it. Like for instance, like the grief of my parents being divorced, and how their marriage really like affected, and that their divorce really affected myself and my siblings. And over time, just kind of felt like ignoring it or not engaging with that or not going to counseling was the better way than like actually engaging and actually getting help. And so the more that I sat with like my grief, the more that things came up, things that I had lost, family members that I had lost, or relationships that felt like broken in some way, including my relationship with my parents. And I think naturally that was a starting place for me when I was thinking about the events of Things We Couldn't Say. Who, there's just a boy who has a broken relationship with people, a broken relationship with his mom, a broken relationship with his father. And I wanted to show like how does that affect him as he kind of goes through his life trying to navigate what is love, what is family, like who am I, what do I want out of the world, what is the deepest desire of my heart, how can I heal? And those are some questions that I was like asking myself as I was like kind of going through the motions of the pandemic.
Yeah, that I know here in Avon, we were the first school district to close in the Midwest because we had one of the first cases. So we definitely felt that from the very beginning. And I know that we're still dealing with the effects of it. And our students may still feel similar to, how well you voiced your thoughts, that we're still going through all of that.
Right.
I hear it from students a lot. So yes, definitely.
Yeah.
I'm kind of using some of our questions from our students too. But I'm going to kind of go into your, if you can give us a little background on how you became a composer, musician, what you play, that would be awesome because we have a very large music program here.
Yeah, you guys are great.
Yeah.
I remember being in the Ben Davis marching band, competing against you guys every year and losing. So
we've got a pretty great program here. So a lot of our students are involved with that. But so yeah, what's that part of your life like?
Sure. So I oftentimes say before I was a writer in the sense of using words, I was a writer of music. I started falling in love with stories even through music, instrumental music too. And so when I was in middle school, I was a part of, the band. I was in the middle school concert band and the jazz band. And
And which middle school did you go to?
so I went to Lyndhurst Middle 7th
Okay.
Center in that district. And before that, actually, I went to Northfield Middle School in Washington Township, I believe.
Washington Township, yeah.
Yep. So I split my time in both of those places because we ended up moving. But I was part of the band in both of those schools and was essentially like, I was like, man, like this is really fun to write and to experience the power of story even through instrumental music together. Like I remember like when we would get a piece of music, like the band director would always like tell us the story behind the music, like what the music was about. I remember being like, wow, like that's so cool. Like there are no words, but it's like, we're telling a story through just playing the flute or playing clarinet or whatever. And I actually played both tenor sax and the bassoon. Those are my primary instruments when I was in band. But then I was like, at some point I was like, oh man, like I want to see if I can do this. If I can tell a story through writing something or composing music. And I remember out of like, even like a place of pride and arrogance of being like, I want to write something that's cool, like something that's not like boring or whatever, but something that's like cool and edgy and new. It might even have some influences of like, hip hop or like, part of my culture, in the music that we could play in band. I remember going home one night and downloading like a free music software where I could, write some music and just started playing around on there and was like, man, this is actually really fun to like compose music. A lot of my early things were like just so bad, but it was just still really fun to just like create something and like hear it played back, and the more that I kind of like cultivated that practice and like worked at it, the more I was like, okay, I'm getting better. Like I'm growing at this. Like, I am learning things, even though I was like, I don't know if the flute can play this, but I'm going to write this flute part because it sounds cool when I play it back. But then I'd like let friends take a look at it and they would play it. And I'd be like, okay, maybe I need to go back and like take it down an octave because it's too high, things like that. But then I remember being, oh man, I was like a freshman in high school. So after leaving Lyndhurst, I went to Penn Davis and composed like my first ever full kind of concert band piece / symphony, and was like, man, this is okay. It's not bad. Like this is my first ever like full work. And I remember sending it to just a bunch of random direct conductors that I like saw on the internet. And one guy responded to me like the next day and was like, I would love for our like band to perform this and we'll send you like recording and everything. And it was actually a conductor and band in Wakayama, Japan.
Wow.
And I remember being like so blown away because they would send me a recording and they performed it on my birthday. And I just like cried. I was like, man, like my stuff that was in my head, that I put on like a music notation software is now being performed in Japan. And then after that, like started me publishing my music, and so now bands all over the place, are playing my music as well. And I'm getting like requests, monthly for bands and orchestras to have me, write music for their ensemble, as a way of like telling stories and as a way of like diversifying their music repertoire and things like that. And just feels really humbling and fun just to do that. And so these days I am not composing as often as I'd like, because I've just been really focusing on my like author career.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, also just pays better. So, but also now my primary instrument is drums. And so I play drums in a small band here in Muncie. So I'm actually working on recording a album with this band. And
what's the name of the band?
Right now we're called the Muncie Music Collective. So we're gonna work on our name, but yeah, that's been fun.
Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing. How did you, as a freshman, who composed this piece, how did you have the confidence to go forward and, put yourself out there and do that? Where does your confidence come from?
Hmm. I think my confidence comes from the fact that like I felt, and this is true in like both my music, but also my writing, is like that idea of like being underrepresented. This idea of, um, man, when we did receive sheet music in band class, like I would go home and look up that piece, of music, and look at that composer, and usually they were like old white guys, which they can produce some really great music and great work, no shade there, but was like, oh man, like no one young, let alone like black or brown, um, were given access to publishing concert band music, or in the sense that, what we were able to perform in middle school or high school or whatever. And so just felt like out of a place of, I'm just gonna see if this works. I'm gonna see if people can take a chance on me. And so I remember, actually, this is actually something I've never admitted before, but I remember actually what I what I did was, when I was sending out my music to different music publishing companies, I would make sure that in my email that they wouldn't know like who I was or like what I look like, because I was like, in case it is like a racial thing, I don't want them to like see a black person, like a little icon that's on my email, and not take a chance on me. And so I was like, I want them to kind of approach us from a very like neutral place. um and I got a lot of people rejecting me. A lot of people were like, hey, how about you call me on the phone and we could like edit this together before I even say yes to publishing it. And then there are people who are like, yes, absolutely, like this is a great piece of work. Just and that affirmation keeps you going, right? That affirmation keeps you wanting to write more and submit more music and see how far you can go. Um and once people, I think in the last several years recognize, oh no, diversity is an important thing, like diversifying, you know, not just literature, but also music, and classical music and concert music. Um, and especially for schools, right? Like music that is written primarily for like schools, needs to be diverse in the age that we live in. And so I think that's been a recent push for the music publishing industry that I've luckily gotten to like help them with. So
Yeah, that's awesome. That's
yeah.
awesome. So can you tell us anything about what you're working on right now? Your upcoming.
Um, yeah, I mean, I have some really cool projects um, that I can't really talk about right now, but one project is I'm partnering with Netflix on currently, and it's been really fun to write and really awesome to get to meet with producers and things like that. And so
Oh, that's
that
really
be,
exciting.
yeah, I mean, some information about that should be coming out later this year, is what I'm told. So that's been one thing that I've been working on, really busy with. But also my next original young adult novel, is I'm only kind of halfway done writing it. But it's something that's kind of the same vein as like my other books in the like grief,
Yeah.
story. But it's also my like first attempt at writing like a traditional love story, like an arc of a love story, which I used to be adamantly like against. Like I'm opposed to the love story. But in the age of you know the last like year, coming out of COVID, and knowing that my other two books are just kind of sad, I was like, maybe I'll try to write a love story and give my readers like a break, from being so sad in the things that I write. So, um, but I'm really really loving it. I feel like it is probably my strongest book so far, and obviously that's all you can hope for as an author, is like that you are getting better with each book that you write, that you're not going back. And so I feel like looking back at what I'm writing now, and when I wrote Tyler Johnson, Things We Couldn't Say, I can feel myself growing as a writer, in the ways that I literally write, but also in the way that I like story tell. And so really excited about it.
That's awesome. So one of our students, Janelle Walker from Mrs. Hatchett's class, and they're joining us today, wanted to know when you started to know that you had a passion to write. So you talked about when Tyler Johnson was here, was the like started as a short story, but when did you really start with that passion? And what was the first step you took to pursue things when you were much younger?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, so I can trace my love of writing like back to my early childhood. But I think kind of the moment where it really clicked for me of like, oh, like I could do this was, I remember being like in the 5th grade and having this assignment of uh, just writing a poem for your mom. And it might have been like Mother's Day. I don't remember why we had to write a poem for our mom, but we did. And I remember writing it, and I was like, okay, like I'm using some like, metaphor, and I'm like, I was feeling like, a young Shakespeare or something like that. And I remember going home and showing my mom like this poem, and she just wept. She just wept like reading it, and I was like, either I'm a really good writer, or she's just like extra emotional right now, because her son has written her poem. Um, but I like to believe it was the first thing, the first option of like I was just a really good writer. And so I was like that, seeing that reaction, I was like, oh man, like I can write something and people feel things. Wow, like and so I remember keeping like just journals like in my room, my bedroom, and that I would like kind of hide under my pillow of like Harry Potter fan fiction, and um other kind of like fan fictions that I was like enjoying in the moment, like Disney Channel TV shows that I was watching, or whatever, Nickelodeon TV shows, and um, eventually started like making up my own stories in those journals by the time I was like in middle school. But those were things that I never shared with anyone. I just kind of like kept to myself, you know. But still just really enjoyed like getting to sit down and like write. Because back then I didn't have like a laptop or anything, so I was actually like using a pencil and paper, and it took a lot longer to write things. But it was still the experience of sitting down with pen or pencil, and like writing things in a journal, and like putting in like indentions and things like that, and or whatever. And I was like, this is nice. Like I'm kind of like, you know, calming myself. I'm like not feeling as anxious. And being someone who's like I was a really shy and introverted kid, and someone who doing something like this, like I would never be able to do, because I just was like so anxious and nervous and like timid. Um, it allowed me to kind of go to a different world. It allowed me to kind of step away from my reality. Um, and that was just really, really beautiful. And that's still probably my favorite part about writing today, is like it allows me to like, even though a lot of the things that I've written have been part of my life, part of my story in some way, I've fictionalized everything enough that like it feels like I'm stepping into like a different world for a period of time, that feels like, okay, in this world, like you don't have to worry about the worries or the problems of your life, Jay. You can just write and be with these characters, where there are no problems that I directly have. It's been really nice.
Yeah. Who's your favorite character? You talked about how you interview your characters and you build them that way. So who's your favorite?
Oh wow, I really really love the character Ollie in Things We Couldn't Say. I felt like I don't know, like he has been one of the characters that I've loved writing the most out of all of the books that I've written so far. And obviously Geo has a like special place in my heart. Like again, like his story has just been with me in a time of like isolation and grief, you know, with the start of the pandemic. But so I'd say probably a tie between the two of them.
Okay. What do you like? What is it that you like about Ollie?
I feel like Ollie reminds me of one of my like best friends. Ollie is someone who's kind of like I feel like every friend circle needs that comedian, right? And I feel like Ollie for me was like the comedian of the friend group that's depicted in Things We Couldn't Say. And it's needed for Geo. Like Geo needs Ollie to be um kind of like a balance to him, because you know Geo is oftentimes like very anxious and very in his head and very like internal, and I feel like Ollie helps draw him out a little bit more and to remind him, hey, like, you know, like life life is hard and life does like mess with you over and over again, but there are times where we can just take life easy, you know, where we can sit back and enjoy the moment before us. And I feel like Ollie's really in tune with that. If like he's like, life, we don't have to take it as seriously, you know. And I really appreciate it about him, because I'm not wired that way at all. But having the Ollies in my life, you know, I'm like, I need that balance, you know.
Yeah, definitely. Well, from Savannah Wang in Mrs. Seaver's class, she says that in an interview, you mentioned that taking breaks and pacing yourself when writing has helped you to deal with self-doubt and insecurity. How do you pace yourself when you're writing, and how do you determine when you might need to take a break from writing?
Who did you say asked that question?
Savannah asked that question.
Shout out to Savannah, because she really did the research, you know, to find out that I was that I said that, because I did say that, and that is true, absolutely true. I do uh, take the necessary time that I need, because I am never someone who's like I feel like some authors, and this is like not me shading anyone, but I think this is just a reality of like sometimes, because we are in an industry that's like you're on a deadline, you're in a contract, we need your next thing. Some people are just okay with putting out whatever. Like they're like, I'll just write a book just to write it, just so I can collect the paycheck, and you guys have a book, and we can move on. Which is great. Like you know, I think that's, you know, fine for people who work that way, you know, who are able to like just crank out things just for the sake of cranking out a book. But for me, I feel like I am oftentimes like the very opposite of that. Like I'm like, everything has to feel like Shakespeare. You know, I have to like sit down and like make sure this is like a classic for years and years to come, or something that people can, you know, look back on a reference like for years to come. And so it oftentimes like is just a very stressful experience, because I'm like really worried about like, oh, like what metaphors could I put? How can I make this sentence more like poetic? You know, the structure of the story. And obviously like it's very common for like authors to like get so caught up in reading like Goodreads reviews or like Amazon reviews. And I struggle with that. Like I feel like I know it's not good for me to do that, but I find myself doing it anyway. And it just makes you feel like really insecure, right? Seeing, oh man, someone that you don't even know has like rated your book at 1.5 stars or 2 stars, and they left a review of like everything that they hated about it. And it's usually something that you're like, oh, I actually enjoyed that part of my book, but this person hated it. And then you kind of like retreat, and you're like, man, like this is really, really hard to deal with and or to navigate with. And so when you're going to write something else, like you just feel kind of like stuck, you know, in a way. And as a way to kind of like pace myself and combat the insecurity, I like give myself the permission to step away. You know, I have to tell myself it is okay to like step away. And I mean, I did that between, you know, writing Tyler Johnson and Things We Couldn't Say. You know, I mentioned that earlier, like years where I was like, I can't write, you know, because I need to heal and recover from that first. And what that looked like practically was stepping away and being like, okay, I'm going to close my laptop and I'm going to do other practices. You know, I'm going to practice like going for a walk and just kind of meditating on this walk, or just kind of like slowing down, and being still, hanging out with friends, watching TV shows or rewatching movies that I really love, just to kind of like get those creative juices flowing again, but also as a way of saying like, okay, like I can live my life apart from like having to write a story that is for other people, because it's like primarily like the story is supposed to be for me, right? Like I'm the one who's writing the story because it means something to me, and kind of having to relearn that by stepping away. So that's been my like practice, is like kind of just going on with my life and like saying no to myself when it comes to writing. Like, no, you don't have to write today. You don't, there's no such thing as writing every day. Like, people who say that, I think that's so unfair and unrealistic, because that creates just a lot of shame when you don't, write every day. I've had to like unlearn that for myself too.
Yeah. Do you think that the times in which we live, if prior to social media or prior to Amazon reviews or everything else, that you would not have felt that way or have encountered that?
I feel like, I feel like reviews and this just the access of social media has made so many people, more insecure, and so many people like more like aware of just the hurtful, negative things that people say about one another, and as someone who's just a naturally insecure person anyway, like sometimes people are like tagging me in things. Other times it's like I'm looking for it. Like I'm looking to see what are people saying. Like I remember like the other day I like searched on my Twitter page, like in the search engine, I searched my book title, and I saw people talking about it, like people like in the reviews, and people, recommending it to other people. And it was like, oh man, like this is really cool. And there are people who were like, stay away from this book, like whatever, like this book is the worst. And I'm like, okay, well that, it makes you want to like say something to that person, but it's like, no, I'm not going to engage at all, because it's like, that's weird. And that's like not my place. I can get over it. But certainly having the access to like social media and just knowing that it's all one click away, just on your phone, it is really, really discouraging. So without that, I'm sure life would feel easier. And I might be cranking out a book a year or a book every 6 months, if that were the case. But fortunately, not the reality.
Larimar Ruiz is our next question in Mr. Tom's class. And they want to know, do you ever struggle with writer's block? And if so, how did you conquer that? And they continue with, I personally struggle with it a lot, and it's a long time before I can write again. So spill your secrets.
I feel like I've definitely experienced writer's block. I mean, even after Things We Couldn't Say came out, like before I started writing the book that I'm currently writing, I felt like I was dealing with the worst case of writer's block. I was like, I have no motivation to write again. I have no motivation to sit down and, I feel like that's the saddest part, because for something that was once like a dear, dear passion for me, has now become this, like, it's not my job, right? It's not my job to write books for people to read. And that's been the saddest part, is like, I feel like it's somewhere along the way, like, even though I really like love the finished product, it feels like, man, like my passion for it is like shifted and ebbed and flowed over the course of my career as a writer so far. And so with every book that I release, I'm noticing I'm feeling more and more like distant from things, and more like I don't feel as passionate anymore about this, because I'm having to meet a deadline, and other people are like correcting my story, they're editing my story, and they're adding things to it and making recommendations. And though that's good, and I think I'm grateful to my editors and my agent for all of their very, very, very sage advice, but at the same time, it's like, man, like this was once just something that I did for myself, Now it's like I'm having to meet expectations of like people, like others, like
Yeah.
thousands of people even, and so as a way to kind of combat like this, my writer's block this past season that I just got out of just being stuck, I just spent some time reading. Like I spent time reading books that I loved, reading books that people sent to me to blurb.
Mhm.
And so um, I think that can be a place where we can like naturally compare ourselves when we're reading like, other people's work, and we're like, oh man, like look at how beautiful this book is, or look at how like awesome uh, this author writes. Like I mean, I'm actually on my desk right here. I have like every Adam Silvera book ever written right here. Um, and was just looking at like, man, look at how awesome Adam writes, and I've read like all those books in this past season of me experiencing writer's block. But doing something like that and just completely disengaging from writing, it's like helpful for me. But I think it really is like one of those things where it's like what works for me doesn't necessarily work for other people. Like, like you have to find out what works for you to combat or fight writer's block. The worst thing that you can do though is try to write yourself out of it. I think some people are like, let me just write I'm just gonna like put some words on the page and see what happens. And it's like sometimes actually like you just need to listen to that feeling of like I feel stuck. And instead of like trying to write yourself out of it, like say, okay, maybe I need to take a step back. And it's okay to be like, okay, instead of taking this 30 minutes that I would normally to write, I'm gonna watch you know, Disney Plus, I'm gonna rewatch Encanto or something like that.
Yeah.
Which helps me for sure.
Yeah. Kind of get out of your own head
Right,
and into
exactly.
something else.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Getting out of your head and getting out of like the expectations that you have for yourself and the expectations that you feel like maybe even other people have for you, because it's like depending on where you're at in like the journey of writing, like depending on where you're at in your career as a writer, even if you're just starting out, if you're published, if you're in pursuit of an editor agent, like there's still that pressure of expectations, that you place on yourself and that other people place on you, or that you can convince yourself that other people have for you. And so stepping away, even like just to go and get ice cream with a friend, is really helpful. So
Okay. Ice cream is always helpful.
yeah.
So Amari Williams in Mrs. Seaver's class would like to know how is going to Ben Davis High School different from your experience at like Ball State or at a college or university, and how did you adapt to it? So what was like the transition like going from high school to college, and how did you adapt?
Mm-hmm. There were a lot of transitions between high school and college. I mean, one was I was living with my parents, then I was living by myself or on my own. So it was a lot of me having to like really mature quickly, really grow up kind of quick. And I wasn't someone who was ever like, like I got to get out of my parents' house. Like I have to leave this place. Like it wasn't the best place for me, but it also wasn't like the worst. And so I felt like there was a lot of like sadness even for me going to college, because it was like, man, I'm going, even though I'm only like an hour or so down the road,
Mhm.
I was like, man, my family isn't in the same city as me, and that there's something sad about that. And it was like, I'm moving on, I'm like stepping into adulthood, you know? And so that was an adjustment of just like the familial aspect to it. But also like everything was my responsibility now, like I was responsible for scheduling classes. I was responsible for going to them. And if I didn't go, there wasn't my mom there being like, why aren't you going to school? It was more of like, I would just get a grade that, you know, was based on like my attendance or something like that, for the number of times I went to class or didn't go to class. And it's like, well, now I have to be more intentional with like my time, but I also feel like even like the cultural, like I feel like coming to Ball State in particular was like a culture shock for me in a lot of ways, because Ben Davis is a very diverse place. There's a lot of people from very different backgrounds and ethnicities and experiences, whereas coming to Ball State in particular, it wasn't super diverse. Like, I didn't see a whole lot of people, or I didn't have a whole lot of classes with people who looked like me or had experiences or were from areas that I was from. And so that was kind of like interesting to navigate, of like, how do I now interact in a mostly white space, as myself and as someone who's just written a book about race and and things like that. But very quickly, I found my people, found people who were safe and people who I could be myself around and you can share and talk about really vulnerable things with. So finding your people is like something that takes more of an effort in college, I've learned. So but I had a really good experience at Ball State. So
Yeah. And you're still in Muncie, so
and I'm still in Muncie. So if any of you listening ever come to Ball State, and if I'm still here, we can have coffee.
Hey, there we go. Well, Annabelle Hernandez in Mrs. Seaver's class would like to know, what is your current favorite song?
My current favorite song. I've been really, really, really obsessed with Jealousy by Olivia Rodrigo. I really, really love her. I also really love Billie Eilish. And so I can't really pick between what song by Billie Eilish, but if I had to, maybe Everything I Wanted.
Good choices.
I was like, I create little playlists every time I write a book, and actually, like, Things We Couldn't Say comes with like a slew of playlists in that book. And probably in like most of my playlists in like my writing playlists have some sort of like Olivia Rodrigo or Billie Eilish, just because they set the vibes right. I love it.
Yeah. Well, and Zoe Kaufelt in Mrs. Seaver's class wants to know, how did you get the idea to mix the music and the books together?
Yeah. Again, that was something that came kind of naturally as I like sat down and like let Gio take me on the journey of like what the story would be about. I knew when I was kind of like getting to know Gio as a character that he really enjoyed playlists, and that was a way of healing for him and coping. And that's something that I do too. I for different seasons of my life I create playlists, and that's something that I found was naturally something that fell into Things We Couldn't Say, because I think he's just loves music and he's able to identify songs that like match what he's going through, or songs that he listens to and it takes him back to a particular moment. And I think that's very similar to like what I do. I listen to songs just to get into a certain headspace. Like if I'm writing a sad scene, I'm going to listen to some really sad music, and I feel like Gio would be the same way.
Okay. We had some other questions here.
Sure.
I am trying to, I went through, just in general, Savannah France in Mrs. Seaver's class wants to know, what was your experience like growing up in Indianapolis?
That's a really great question. It was fine. I mean, it was fine. I really wish, like, looking back, I really wish I would have taken advantage of growing up in Indianapolis more. Like, I don't know what that necessarily means or looks like, but I felt like I was such a shy kid that I was like, I would go to school, come home from school, that was it. Like, I wasn't someone who was like hanging out with friends at their houses. I wasn't going and getting involved in like a ton outside of school. But I wish I would have, had opportunity or allowed myself the opportunity to do that. And I also feel like just my parents, like, we grew up, I grew up like essentially at borderline poverty, like we didn't have a lot of resources. My mom had to work multiple jobs just for our family to stay afloat. And so it required me to kind of even help raise and be there for my younger siblings as like a third parent, almost as like the older sibling. And so in some ways, I feel like me and a lot of my experience of growing up in Indianapolis was like taken just because of like the circumstances that like my family faced, and the hardships that we faced. So it's difficult, but fine. I think I feel, I mean, now that I'm a somewhat successful writer, um, looking back on getting to tell those experiences and share those stories in my writing, it's been like, in some ways, I'm glad that I experienced those things to be able to like uplift people who are currently experiencing that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that definitely comes through in the character of Geo, that aspect of things. And especially when you said taking care of your siblings, that really comes forth in that as well.
Yeah.
So yeah. We're nearing our end of our time together. So my last question for you is, as we've got our freshman English students that are listening to us today, what advice would you have for them? Either general life advice or writing advice, class advice, just kind of what would you like to tell them?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Also, there's the son of I would say, man, I feel like the piece of advice, I feel like I get this question every time I do like an event with high schools, which is like a great question, but I feel like my advice never feels like sufficient. But I share the same thing every single time. And it's just that like I believe that we all have stories, like we all have stories that matter, like, and none of them are the same, like none of them overlap. And I feel like no matter what stage of life you're in, no matter how old you are or how young you are, that your unique story matters. It is important. And if you feel a call, if you feel a call in your life to tell it, do it. Like write those words down in your timing, right? Like you don't have to do it every day. You don't have to do it overnight, but over the course of your life, even, just write that story, because the world deserves to hear it and needs to hear it and wants to hear it. And just reminding yourself that like you matter, because I feel like that's something, again, going back to the Enneagram, I feel like for me being an Enneagram 9, that is something that I feel like if I could go back in time to tell high school Jay, is that like you matter, your story matters, despite your circumstances, despite what the world may tell you, despite what you might see in the media or on the news. But you matter and your story does too.
Yeah, I love that. Well, thank you so much for your time today and our classes. Thank you for attending. I do still have some free books to give away. So those will be coming soon, and I'll share that information with your teachers. So thank you to our freshman English classes. And we're going to continue in a little bit with our creative writing classes. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
And I'm going to